All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Araya Harley, and I am the Communications and the Events Manager for the Kent Chamber of Commerce. And today we will be working on the Series 3 of our grant writing workshop with Dr. Angela Beard. She's going to be our presenter today, and we are going to discuss writing about the effectiveness of your programs and budgeting for success. And of course, like our other grant writing sessions. If there are any questions, feel free to ask in the chat or on Facebook. We're open to your questions. We will also have a portion at the end for Q&A. As we mentioned, this will be live streamed on Facebook as well as recorded. So if you happen to come in through the end or through the middle of that and you need that recording, just shoot us an email or visit our YouTube channel and you'll have that. Again, good afternoon to everyone, and I will go ahead and bring it over to Dr. Beard and she will start our presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see you, or see, in quotation marks, you today here, especially on this beautiful day. It's so bright and sunny. My name is Angela Beard, and I am a middle-aged white woman with green eyes, red hair. I'm wearing glasses and sitting in front of a brown wall with the painting of the Boaters Luncheon on it. And for anyone who needs them, we can turn on the captions, I think, can't we, Araya? So those are optional. You can turn them on or off down at the bottom of your screen. And today, like Araya said, we're going to speak about the evaluation, describing how effective our programs are, and the grant budget. A lot of material to cover today. I was working on my PowerPoint thinking, how am I going to get through all this? So without further ado, let's talk about what the takeaways are. I want you to finish this at 5 o'clock, hopefully, fingers crossed, with understanding the options for describing your program evaluation. There are several. Some tips on conducting evaluation if your organization is new to it. Hopefully, even if they're not, there'll be some helpful tips for you. And constructing a revenue and expense budget for your proposal. And I'm going to start off with a little very informal poll. In your work, so I can get a sense of who we have in the crowd here, how many of you, type of 1, if you design and implement program evaluation yourselves, and 2, if you write about the evaluation for your grants that others are in the organization or consultants are doing? What have we got going on out there? So someone, Anne, writes about it. Great. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to contribute? We've got a lot of interactive things today too. Okay, so we've got 50-50. One who does it themselves. Is it Fania? Have I got that right, Fania?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. And Regina, okay, the folks who do it themselves are taking the lead. So you're doing and writing, as I'm assuming. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. I wrote this presentation based on having to do everything yourself, because I know that's a position many of you find yourselves in, that you are it for your shop. And so I wrote it with that in mind, both for the evaluation and the budget piece. Questions at any time, of course. Moving on with my arrows, hopefully. This is the mouse today. Which one does the computer want? The mouse. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about some of the challenges to evaluation. And this is another tough part of the proposal. Not as hard as a needs statement, in my opinion, but it's up there. So what are some of our challenges in either in conducting and writing about reporting on the impact of our programs? There's no data and funders want it. Sometimes things are hard or expensive to measure, right? It's a new organization or project. You don't have a track record yet. Outcomes are difficult to measure. You know, how do you measure quality of life, for example? There are a lot of instruments. It's not ever been clear that anyone has been captured or captures it, or there's no bandwidth for evaluation. You're barely able to get the programs up and running and sleep too. So anyone what are your particular challenges, especially folks who are doing ad writing? What would you like to know more about that, or what would be helpful to you? Everybody has it down? Folks are you shy today? What's going on? Oh, hi there. I remember you from last week, Eagle's Nest. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. So if you're struggling with evaluation, the news flash, which probably isn't one at all, is that it's not going away. Donors and funders are even more interested now in knowing the impact of their investments in your programs. Quicker and cheaper data, in theory, at least, also makes them more willing to ask for it. You know, the cost of doing evaluation is going down. There are a lot more calls for accountability. People want to know that their money is being spent wisely, going towards what they gave it for, that the promises or the goals that the organization shared as part of their pitch are in fact being realized. And moving on, I don't know, that was one of those blips that you have with every presentation, right? Every time you present, there's just one little blank spot. So what might be some of our objectives of evaluation? And by ours, I mean nonprofits, the program folks. Why do we do this other than to keep the funders happy, which I understand can be a valid reason? And why am I asking you about this? Because as you plan, part of your grant writing strategy and of course your program planning, and I am not a programming expert, I'll say that right up front. I've always been behind the scenes, raising the money, administering, whatever. I do not know much about implementing programs, except for ballet because I was a dancer, but we won't go there. So as you plan for your programming or work with your program folks in planning your grant strategy, what are the goals of your evaluation process for you writing these grants? Well, I'm throwing out a few of them here. Feel free to type some more in the box if you find something I haven't mentioned. You want to take responsibility for effective programming, right? We have the trust of the public. We want to be sure that we deserve that by being responsible, by being able to come back and say, yes, we did what we said we were going to do, and this change happened, right? We want to report to our constituents on the success of our programming, our donors, the clients themselves, of course, our government officials, our board. I don't consider constituents, I consider them part of the organization, but however you look at them, we want to be able to tell the board that our programming is effective. We want to take the feedback from monitoring our services and use it to adjust, right? And that might be anywhere from demonstrating that what we planned and are doing is working, to figuring out who benefits the most, which elements are most or least successful of a particular program, make sure that everything is consistently implemented across the board, and quantify the benefits that our program provides to individuals or society or animals or whoever it is that we're serving, right? This information also tells us where to allocate our resources. Okay, if we found something works better than others, we're more likely to go in that direction, right? And put money and staff and whatever else needs to happen there. And I think I'm hiding this last one. And then respond to changing internal and external circumstances. Not everything's going to stay the same all the time. Demand's going to change. You know, this COVID, I did some reading on the impact of COVID on hunger and preparing for this. Me and my thing with hunger, I really hate it. And it was amazing all the, the changes that nonprofits had to make and how they figured out they needed to make those, all to do with how they conducted evaluation of their services. So far, so good. Any questions? Okay, so we know our objective has, our evaluation has objectives. So when we're focusing on a specific grant or project, right? we have already written. Last week, we talked about writing the project narrative, right? So what did that include? That included the goals that we wanted to achieve with the project. We start our narrative off by saying, our goal is to change X, Y, and Z. We want to alleviate hunger. We want to have all of our fifth graders get higher grades in reading and math. We want to, whatever it is we're trying to achieve, those are the goals of our project, right? So coming back to that narrative, when you start writing about evaluation, you need to go back to what you said you wanted to achieve and make sure, and you're planning or you're writing, whatever stage you're at, that your evaluation goals and plan matches what your project goals are, okay? And this does matter. We talked a lot about focusing in on what we want to achieve, and while saying that one of the contributing factors to hunger is poverty, our goal is not going to be with one project to eradicate poverty, right? How they're conceived and written matters. And I've supervised so many wonderful grant writers who really wanted to change the world, and yet they would go off on the tangent and say, we are going to solve poverty. We're going to cure cancer, you know, and I'm kind of like, guys, I love you and I love your passion, but we got to report back on this project to a funder. And if you tell them that we're going to eradicate poverty, and it comes back that we have not, well, our credibility is going to be a little shaky. Not our passion, but our credibility, right? So here is an example of two different goals that we might say. Again, I'm big on hunger. The goal of our food bank program is to eliminate hunger in our community. Example number 2, the goal of our food bank program is to serve 500 people experiencing food insecurity a week. Which one do y'all think is more appropriate for a food bank program? 2, right? We would love to know that eventually food insecurity is going to be eradicated. It's not likely to happen with this one particular program that we are writing. All right. So when we have established our goals, what are the options for describing our impact? There are 4, and maybe more. I mean, this field changes all the time. So there are 4 general categories. Please jump in at any time to share what you're all doing in your organization. First of all, of course, you want to be sure who you're talking to. Who's your audience? What do your funders and your donors want to know? Okay. The first opportunity is to talk about replicating best practices in other communities, and then we'll get to more detail on each of these as we go. Client stories, so anecdotal evidence, monitoring, and tracking and reporting on outcomes, okay? Replication of best practices. This is for newer programs where there isn't a lot of data. There's not a track record, right? So this borrows, in quotation marks, as you can see, the results of a similar program in another community. Back to our summer feeding program at Skykomish, right? Even though Skykomish is a little bit smaller than I told y'all, we still don't want hungry people there. So if we were saying how we would evaluate that feeding program, we can't say, yes, we have fed over the last 5 summers 150 kids. Haven't done it yet. It's a brand new program, right? But we can say that in Gold Bar, which ends up being very close to Skykomish, there are 2 feeding sites, 2 summer feeding sites that feed 10%, 20%, wouldn't it not be nice if it was 100% of the low-income children in that community, K through 12. That's replicating best practices, looking at what's going on in other communities, what you intend to do, and being able to attach, numbers, making it smart, okay? So far, so good? I'm charging on ahead. There's so much information. Client stories. Client stories, when you combine them with monitoring data outputs, you can make a really compelling discussion, right? Here's the example I found. When it was a quote from a client, or from a funder, pardon me. If you're on a Meals on Wheels program, I already know that you serve 1,000 meals a day. So there's your outputs, right? There's your data, in quotation marks. But tell me about the lives of 1 or 2 of those people who are being served those meals. What difference does it make for them? It's not just about the meal, it's about human contact, okay? So there are 2 impacts right there, the emotional and human impact, and then the number of people who are being fed. You do have to be careful when you tell a client story that you don't generalize without evidence, that what one client's impact was for the whole population that you serve, okay? But you probably already know that. Just in case, so you making a note. Whew, I'm on a roll. So far, so good. Any questions yet? Okay, we're gonna keep on trucking. Next is monitoring data. And this can take a number of forms. We'll want to talk about financial information. Almost every grant has a report that you need to return as to what was spent and what was brought in by the program. We want to know about key activities, right? We want to be able to answer, are we reaching the population we said we would serve? Who's using the services? If they're not using services, why do we think that might be so, right? Did people participate? Is there any feedback from the clients or the population that you're serving? You know, do we survey them? When we're getting their stories, how do we think they feel about it? Or what are their suggestions, right? This is I think, more, conventional idea of evaluation. And there's reasons for that, right? And finally, I have to say a bit about outcomes. So not only because of language and terminology, but because of this is the pinnacle to which we aspire, right? So in program delivery, in just about any production process, if you will, there are outputs and there are outcomes. All right. So I used to work in the arts. I worked in the arts for 4 million years, at least, maybe 5. And I was their grant manager. And so I did a lot of this with reporting to foundations and government on the impact that the arts programming had on people's lives. Well, it's easy to talk about outputs in the arts. Outputs are like the slide before, the data that we track for activity, how many people attended, right? How many tickets were sold, how many free tickets were given away, how many performances did we offer, what was the capacity of the house, and how many of them lived in King County because King County gave us money for the theater or whatever. That's all outputs. Those are counts, numbers of services provided, that kind of thing. But what I wrestled with, and still to this day do, as I'm sure do many of you, were the outcomes, right? Because, and I say this to a lot of folks I supervise, again, you can get 3,000 people into a theater to see a performance of Nutcracker. But if they all fell asleep, who cares, right? Did it change them? Did it inspire them? Did it make their lives better for 3 hours? And that's a hard thing to know. But that is the outcome that we hope for in the arts. Just like last week, we talked about outcomes in preventing hunger, right? There's short-term and long-term. Short-term is, we serve this many meals, people go to sleep with food in their stomach at night, etc. Long-term, there are health outcomes, there are mental health outcomes, there are, low mothers that are underfed have lower birth weight. And I was doing more research about it last night and getting horrified all over again. And these are the long-term things that we'd like to achieve. We want to make sure that child is healthy enough and doesn't go to the emergency room or isn't, you know, undernourished, so they aren't as hardy and strong and etc. But we aren't always going to be able to evaluate that unless we have the funds to do a long-term longitudinal study to follow people who use our services for a number of years and see how they come out, right? So outcomes are getting easier to evaluate, but we're not all the way there yet. I would encourage you, though, to consider them again as the gold standard, because this is the change you want to see in your community. This is the change. You want kids to stay out of jail. You want, you know, college students to, if you're giving to a university, you want them to go on and win the Nobel Peace Prize or cure cancer, or, you know, of course I'm being theatrical, but you want to know that your investment made a difference down the road, right? Often this is performed by professional evaluators for a mature program, okay? You want to have a number of years of feedback for yours from your informal surveying or talking to your participants or whatever before you jump into a big program audit, especially, right? And then you're going to have to associate, and this is a real challenge for, I mean, this is really something for the professionals, associate causation with your program intervention, right? You want to be able to say, you know, without a doubt, that the reason that kid, you know, made it through high school and got a scholarship to Harvard is because she didn't go hungry in second grade. That's tough, but it can be done. And like I said, let's keep on dreaming and aspiring to the best that we can do, right? Questions so far? Okay, I'm going to keep moving because I'm almost halfway there. So how do we get started? If you're new to evaluation, right? We want to work with all our constituents to talk about the impacts that we want to have. And then at 3 outcomes, let's start with 3, we want to accomplish with our organization, with our programming, whatever we're focused on at the moment. Now we got to talk about measures, right? And these may be simple. They may be, you know, we serve 500 meals, which, not that it's simple to serve 500 meals, but it's relatively easy to measure. You can stand there with a clicker or, you know, whatever. We want to communicate the measures and integrate them. We want everyone to know what's going on in our programming. We're a team. And then perhaps consider keeping a dashboard for ourselves, our board, even our public. I've been also researching dashboards for another class, and there are organizations that have outward facing dashboards that track their work, and it's, I think, marvelous. But these would include the metrics on many outcomes for program performance, fundraising, all kinds of things for the nonprofit. So far, so good. I think we're about to move on. But first, if you are if you're not involved in evaluation today, or if you feel like you're a little bit out of step or behind or whatever, I want you to think of one step you can take to begin, continue, or improve both your evaluation process, if you're doing it, those brave souls of you that are, and writing about it for everyone on this webinar for your case for support or your grant proposal. One step. And then I want you to email yourself that step at a deadline of your choosing. So if it's something you know needs to be done by the next budget cycle, or something needs to be done by the next grant application or whatever, at futureme.com. And then it's going to pop up on that date and you'll be like, yeah, I got to get on that. That is evaluation. Anybody have questions before we move on to the budget? I'm flying through this, I realize, so don't hesitate to stop and tell me what's on your mind. Nothing? Okay, everybody stand up. 4:30 in the afternoon, we need to stand up. I'm standing, so now you can see all of the voters' luncheon. Oh wait, the sun's reflecting on it. Well, okay, that's a fail. Stand up, Look up and look down, stretch your neck and your shoulders before we sit down again to start part 2. All right. Okay. That felt good. All right. So here's some resources. And again, of course, you'll be getting these slides. I have a bunch of them here. This Bridgespan one is great. And the Council of Nonprofits is always fabulous. Medium and small guy nonprofits here. This book is, I mean, they're all fabulous. So I could say something about every single one. But check it out. They're all free except for the book, which I bought off Amazon, I think for like $11. All right, so let's move on to budgets. And I couldn't present these 3 without having a Chihuahua make an appearance. This little guy is saying that the new budget allows for more milk bones, but we can no longer afford the cat. He looks just like my tinsel. Before you start crunching numbers, okay, first of all, before anybody says anything, who, show me a thumbs up if you hear budget and start twitching? Numbers, math, hated, everybody fighting over their priorities, da da da. Oh, okay, well, there's one honest person, yay. A budget is a plan, okay? I made a mistake here. So I've found when I'm teaching budgeting and financial management that it helps, begging your pardon here, it helps people a lot to understand that a budget is just your plan with numbers attached, okay? It lays out what you're going to do. And I also had a very interesting remark from somebody on a workshop recently that said, she said, a budget is a moral document. It shows your priorities, okay? So if you've got a lot of money put into staff, if you've got a lot of money put into programs, I think you're on the right track. If there's a huge line for entertainment in a nonprofit budget, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Maybe you do a lot of events. But you see what I'm saying? A budget tells us what is important to you, okay? And where you plan to go. So for grant budgets especially, here are a few hints. Here comes my dog. One size does not fit all. And this is one of those sad but true truisms about grant budgeting. It would be nice if we could create one at the beginning of the year, the fiscal year, or go to the finance people and ask them to print out program budgets. And sometimes that works. But more often than not, donors have something specific, or funders want to see something that, not that you haven't accounted for it, but they want to see it in a way that you do not present your numbers. So one of the big challenges in writing a grant budget is translating your finance office's budget into categories that the donor wants to see. And none of them are the same. This is where I fell in love with budgeting. Yes, I am that nerdy person. Come on. In that I got to redo them 5, 6, 8 times a year, depending on what form a donor gave me. So when you see a budget, don't start to wig out if you see, instead of wages, you see personnel or salaries or whatever the donor is calling what you pay your employees, okay? They just all had different terminologies. Yes, it's a bit of a pain, but that's right now how we roll, right? Be sure to check your guidelines for allowable costs, okay? You don't want to include anything in your budget that is not going to be funded. Well, that's not true. That is not allowable. And that usually only applies to governments, right? So let me just tell you one of my stories. I got a lot of funding from the federal government when I was writing grants. And we always got audited, of course, because when you have federal funding at a certain level, you do. And one of the programs that we got funded for did not allow any costs for construction, maintenance of facilities, etc. It was for a particular ballet that a choreographer was coming to create for us. And so he was put up in an apartment and blah, blah, blah. And his plumbing burst one evening. And we had it fixed, of course, and took care of it right away and went on to do his work and etc. And when I reported to the NEA on the program, I included $36 for, I don't know how it was so cheap, but whatever, right? $36 as allocated from the plumbing bill. I got dinged like you can't believe by our auditors, and rightly so, because that was not an allowable cost on for the project. So particularly for government, look at what you're putting in your budget to make sure that it passes muster, okay? Another thing you want to know is if the funder is going to support all costs or only direct costs. And we'll get into this a little bit. It's kind of a big, as you probably know, topic in funding right now, full cost funding and not getting nonprofits out of the scarcity cycle. But we still have folks out there that only support not direct costs, and quite a few of them. So pay attention to that and make sure that you're giving them what they'll accept, basically. Do I need to create a budget myself or adapt one from the program finance office? I always had to create my own. Like I said, maybe you're lucky if you have a big enough finance team, or they've done a lot of work and preparation for you to write grants. Take it, use what you can, right? What type of support am I seeking? When we go back to remember when we were talking about prospect research and the different types of support that are available? That's what you're going to want to budget for. So there is operating support, there is program support, there is startup support, there is capital support, there is endowment support, right? All the different types of asks or programs that you're going to make determine what budget you're going to create for particular application, okay? What should I include? Back to the will the funder support all costs, full program, or direct costs only. And we'll move this guy. Be sure to have a system for annotating your budget, even if the funder does not demand a budget narrative or notes, okay? This is for two reasons. This is so when you have to report on actuals a year ahead or a year and a half after you submitted this thing, you can remember how you calculated your original budget. So if you told them you were going to have 12 dancers for 6 weeks at, $850 a week, and you ended up only having 8 dancers for 6 weeks, or you can say, okay, it was a smaller piece, we used less dancers, that's why this came under budget. Also, when you win the lottery and go on to live in Paris, your predecessor is going to think you were the best grant writer ever if they can go into your work, your notes, and figure out exactly where your numbers came from. And that's important because let me tell you, I once had to reconstruct an entire Gates proposal for $250,000 with no notes at all because the report hadn't been submitted. And yeah, you guys get it. So here are the components of a proposal budget. And I want you to note in particular that revenue and expenses are both included, okay? If you aren't already doing grant budgets and don't know this, this is the biggest mistake my students make on their assignments. They only include the expenses because they're very fixated on how much it's going to cost to put on the program. And that is important and great. But as we talked about last week with sustainability, you have to be able to show that there are other sources of income or revenue for this project. There's community support, right? Other funders are interested. You aren't going to leave it all up to one foundation or one government body to provide you funding for this program. So under revenue, we have contributed and earned, okay? I think everybody should be clear on what that means. Contributed, there are any of these categories: government, foundation, corporate, individuals, or events, maybe more than one. Under earn, here are just a few examples because there's a wide range of opportunities for earned income in nonprofits. Stuff like admissions or tickets or tuition or fees for service or rental fees. It goes on, and you guys probably have your own that you can contribute. Remember, a budget is not There is no one correct way to do a budget. So if you have some category of earned revenue that isn't in the little lines, include it and other and explain it, okay? The organization's cash. And sometimes people twitch when they see this because they are like, well, if we show them cash on hand, why are we asking for funding? They're going to be like, we don't need to fund you. You've got cash. This isn't something that's always going to be included, but I think it's something that you should be aware of. Why is that? Because not all funders pay you up front, okay? Especially government. If you're working with the government, they reimburse you after the project is over, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you have the cash on hand or coming in and confirmed to get the program off the ground, to get it running, okay? So that's why that's there. Expenses, direct. What direct expenses, we get into this a little bit later, are anything that pertains to the project. These are the things that make the wheels turn, right? Salaries and wages, those are your employees. Fringe benefits, well, there's usually a percentage that your finance office can provide you with, or you can calculate as to a class of employee, what their average fringes are, okay? Fees is a bit of a catch-all, but it's anybody who's not an employee. So for example, again, in dance, we had the choreographer fee, the designer fee, the lighting fee, we had to pay royalties on the music, right? Anything that you know, a one-time shot that you have to pay to produce something, that's where it goes. Supplies and materials, another catch-all. Basically anything you need to work with that pretty much physical to make your program roll, and then travel, both local and national, or should I say out of town, if you will. So your mileage and your per diem, if you have to bring in someone from the East Coast to do your well-known choreographer, for example, if your folks need to go to a conference or go be trained or whatever, it's going to go in there. All right, then indirect costs, when allowed, are administration. And let's go on to those. I believe it's the next slide. Oh, I've got the chat box flashing. Anne asks, wouldn't you include a line in revenue for planned requests? Yes, absolutely. We're going to get to a little bit more a breakdown of that in just a minute. Absolutely, yes. In fact, thank you for bringing that. We can talk about it now. In your revenue section, let's see where I talk about this. There it is. Okay, so we will get there, but you absolutely should put your planned asks, and these come from your fundraising plan, right? Sometimes the grant writer is leading the charge on that because you may be writing your grants a year and a half out before the fundraising plan for the year that the program will be implemented is even in play. It's a lonely place to be, but that's why you're doing your prospect research 2 years ahead of time and looking at least planned asks. And you're absolutely right. So I wanted to talk about a note on costs, and this is about allocating costs. All right. So we try to assign costs to the most appropriate category as honestly as possible. One thing I really freak out about, and maybe some of y'all can tell me if this is still the truth, is a contingency in a budget or unidentified costs or anything that flags the donor that there might be some cushion going on in there, the funder. I would advise you to overestimate actual costs rather than inserting a line item for anything for a contingency or unknown, unless it's allowed, of course. Sometimes the funder will let you say, 15% contingency or whatever. But I get very nervous about presenting information for money that looks like it might be going, places that we don't know about, places that are sketchy. Try to assign those costs to the most appropriate category. Say you don't know, like next year, maybe the staff's going to get raises. Budget your wages at 5–10% more. Explain it. We anticipate a cost of living raise. I know, no laughing now, in fiscal year 22. So we are budgeting that inappropriately. Put it in your notes, right? How far into the weeds do you want to get? In some larger organizations, everything is assigned a code, designated, and they really do split a lot of hairs. My example of copier codes, if you guys ever worked somewhere where you have to put a code in so that your copies get assigned to the correct department, if you have the capacity for that level of detail, fabulous, but most nonprofits that I've worked with do not. So I would, don't be careful about getting too far into the weeds, right? Because then you're gonna have to come back on your final report and report on the number of copies that were attributed to this project. I don't think most funders care about that. I may be stepping out on a limb here, but they want to know the big categories, your wages, your supplies, etc. The stuff that's important to taking care of the clients that you work with. Anyone disagree? And the more, the more you split hairs, the more time it takes and the more it costs you. So weigh the benefit against the cost of really splitting up things beyond a level of detail that's realistic and even desirable, okay? Unclear categories in your budget. Sometimes the funder may give you a category that's, I'm trying to think of one that I've had that you're like, what is this? What do they want? Call them, okay? I'm working on my budget. I don't understand the information you want from me. Can you help me? They'll tell you, okay? They'll tell you. Moving on to indirect and direct costs. How am I doing for time? Okay. Direct and indirect costs, like I mentioned before, direct costs are the activities, or I'm reading this out to you, or items associated entirely with the project or program. And this is in their simplest form, right? This may include project materials, program staff salaries, or other fees that pertain only to the program. And we're going to have an example to walk through in just a minute. Indirect costs include items that are associated with running the organization as a whole. Administrative staff salaries, rent, utilities, office supplies, etc. Office supplies can be a tricky one, like we were just talking about. If you have a program where you make up packets to, like we did when I was at CISO, we went into the schools and taught them music for free, and they all had to have copies of music and copies of, they had a little all about, learning how to play your instrument, and there was a lot of copying and involved. Yeah, so that we did charge the program. But when it comes down to, say, making a photocopy of your contract with a partner that uses 2 pieces of paper, I'm not sure you're going to want to get to the nickel and dime level with that. It's an indirect cost of running the organization as a whole. Okay, so far so good. So I, of course, have one of my fictitious examples. This one really is fictitious. Focusing on food insecurity, we're going to go through a couple of examples with a fake shelter that has a soup kitchen. It's one facility with a soup kitchen, the shelter, and the administrative offices all in the same building, okay? And we, right, for the purposes of this, are seeking funding for the shelter itself. So these expense categories that I listed are, again, salaries and wages, fringes, fees, supplies and travel, or supplies, materials, and travel, okay? And then administration down here is what I'm calling indirect costs. Let's go through these on the side, and you're all going to type in where you would put them, okay? Shelter manager's wages. What category does that go in? Big clue there, right? Trying to make it easy on you. It's late in the day. Direct, correct, in wages. Thank you. Shelter managers' fringe benefits. Sometimes these are combined. I split them out when I teach budgeting because people forget them, to be honest with you. They focus on salary. So I do split them out. Yep, they're going to go into fridges. Thank you, Ann and Jeffrey. Food. Where does the food for our soup kitchen go? So, okay, I see flashing. Do we think it's a direct or an indirect cost? Not under shelter. It is a direct cost, but Ann, you're correct. See, I'm trying to see if you guys are paying attention. It is a direct cost of the soup kitchen part of the shelter. So good job. Yay. Laundry costs and bedding, excuse me. Is that a direct cost of running the shelter? Can we run the shelter without it? Yes, Ann, I would put it in supplies and materials too, right? Facility insurance, the insurance for the entire building. Indirect, absolutely correct. Yeah, you guys are still late in the day and you probably want to go out in the sun and you're still on it. So congratulations, way to go. So those are your direct costs, right? Let's talk a little bit more about indirect costs. To what's called allocate or assign an indirect cost, you need what's called a cost driver. And that's big language for a way of assigning it that makes sense according to the nature of the cost, okay? So let's talk about one that's not too hard to understand. Some cost examples for our shelter, our finance staff, right? We don't need them to, they do not run the shelter. They do not greet clients. They do not counsel them. They do not, make up beds or do laundry. But can we do our program without them? No, they are indirect overhead is another word for it. Rent is another one. A part of rent, yes, is the direct cost of running the shelter, but not all of it, okay? So let's look at a little bit more about cost drivers and a little bit more about distributing them in our example here, our shelter example. Do you guys love my graph? What do you think? Can you see the print? It's very small. So in speaking about our shelter, let's talk about how we would allocate the rent expense and give us something to put in our grant, right? Now, sometimes your fabulous finance office does this. Sometimes you have to do it yourself. So let's say for the sake of discussion that the cost item, rent, is $1,000 a month. And you're all laughing, I know, but it makes it easier. The cost driver is this. In this case, I have chosen, you choose, one chooses their cost driver, right? It needs to make sense based on what you are allocating. So in this case, I am choosing the square footage or percent of the facility that is used by each program. Everybody with me so far? Okay. This is a percentage of or my lovely pie is the percentage of what's used in the facility by program, right? So down here in the little tiny print, you can see that the shelter takes up 60% of the building, the kitchen 30%, and the administrative offices take 10%, right? So of our $1,000, we allocate 60% to the shelter, 600, 300 to the for the soup kitchen, 30%, and $100 or 10% to the administration overhead. So in our budget of direct costs, we can include $600 of rent per month over the life of the program. Is everybody with me? Thank you. I see some thumbs up. Thanks, guys. Questions? Okay. Now let's talk, moving on from costs. Phew, right? Let's talk about revenue, which is often much more interesting. We have revenue categories that we went over in a few slides back, but between contributed and earned income, right? And the organization's cash. So for our shelter example, let's start from the bottom up. Organization's cash. Well, let's think about this. Who funds a lot of health and human services? Government. We may have to show some cash in this budget, okay? Because remember, government reimburses, does not give you the check up front. Earned income. Are we going to get any earned income from our shelter clients? What do y'all think? Do they pay to stay there? Do they pay for their meals? No, most likely not. Okay, so earned income is a bust. We can't count on anything there. Our shelter is most likely going to be funded entirely from contributed income. So that's where we get into our fundraising plan, like Anne noted a few slides back, and we look at it and we say, okay, for this fiscal year, what are we planning to raise for the shelter from government? What are we planning to, what foundations are we planning to ask? What applications do we have out? Those are pending. What have we received? That's actual. What can we allocate? Again, that fancy word, from individuals, because individual gifts at the lower levels are generally our lovely unrestricted income, right? And we can, we have the discretion to allocate a certain amount of those to whatever program needs it. We also have major donors who may be designating their gifts to the shelter, etc. And as part of our fundraising plan, which obviously we can't get into here, we know those individuals, we know the likelihood that they'll give and at what level, and we put that in. It is okay. I'm going to give you guys this little pep talk again. It is okay to put planned, pending, and actual, because again, you're probably a year and a half to a year, even 6 months away from actuality, right? And the funders know this. They aren't going to freak. If things change, go ahead and put it in and make sure you're not lying. No lying, but that you have a plan. But it's okay not to have the check in the bank. That freaks a lot of people out, but don't let it do that. The funders know things will change. You know things will change. That's okay, as long as you have a plan and a rationale. Okay? And then there's a possibility of a dedicated event. Maybe you have an event like when I was executive director at Cancer Life Fund, we did an event specifically for our patient assistance fund, which gave grants to lower income cancer survivors so that they could afford their treatment, right? If you have something like that in your plan, great, put it in there, okay? Everybody clear on the options for revenue? Any questions so far? Be sure to include it. It's so important that the funders see that you have a plan, that you have community support, and that, that you're working it, okay? All right, so moving on, a few more tips for your budget. Check carefully that your budget and narrative match. Reread your narrative. What did we say we were going to do? Did we say we'd have a program manager? Oh, look, we said we were going to have 2. Whoops, we better put another one in the budget or take one out of the narrative. What's our real plan? Okay. Even minimal costs should be included, even if it's just a week of staff time or the paper for a survey should be included for planning, implementation we've covered, and evaluation, okay? Our narrative says we're going to distribute a survey to our clients to see how they were satisfied with the services. Well, your budget should show pen and paper survey, Survey Monkey, whatever your distribution mechanism is going to be in your cost. You know, even if it's, you know, $20 for a subscription to Survey Monkey for a month, that shows them what you're doing, that you've got a plan in place, you're doing it, you're working it, and it's going to happen. Okay. And remember, this can also be an area for seeking funding. Say you want to bolster your evaluation efforts, look for a funder that gives money for that kind of thing. Or if evaluation is super important to a current funder, ask if they would be willing to increase their giving by the amount of an evaluator. They're all, you know, you got to keep working an angle, folks. Keep working an angle, okay? Okay, I think that brings us to the end, just barely under the time limit. Questions? Are you all exhausted? This is a lot of material, I know. All right, I, as always, have included budget resources. Oh, wait, is there a question? At the end. You're welcome, Jeffrey. Yeah, overwhelmed. I get that. So, you know, sit down, have a nice spring cocktail, enjoy the sun. And am I accustomed to the revenue expenses matching or two different numbers? I always have them match. You know, if you show that a program is going to make a profit, well, again, a profit, quotation marks, well, then again, what motivation or what reason does the funder have to support you, right? They're like, hey, you're already making money off this thing. If you show that the expenses are higher than the revenue or the projected revenue, well, then you're basically showing that you don't have a plan for sustainability. You know, you're hoping, you're wishing, you're praying, but you don't have it all down on paper and ready to roll. And that there's a difference between that and it being fluid, right? I do too, but I was on a review committee with someone who thought if they match. Okay, well, there are planned or in process requests for individual funding. Okay, well, there are the budget forms that want you to show a whole exactly the size of your request sometimes. But anybody else have a different experience? That's my take on it. All right, folks. Again, more budget resources here. This Candid course is very good. Bridgespan is always good. Check them out when you're not so exhausted. And here's my contact information as always, our Facebook, our LinkedIn. This is the last of these grant workshops. So I just want to tell you, thank you for your loyalty and coming back every week. I've really appreciated getting to sit here and share what is so important to me with y'all. I wish you all the success in your grant seeking efforts. And you have my information if you should need to reach out with questions or ideas to bounce off if you'd like anytime. I am around for you. I get paid to do this. Woohoo! So thank you and thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, again, we do appreciate you. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we will have this recording available. I should email it out to everybody in about 2 days with all the slides. If you have any questions, you do have her contact information, but you can also reach out to the chamber as well at 253-854-1770. Again, if you guys have any questions, just email us, but enjoy the rest of the sun and have a great week. Bye.
Bye-bye.